Can you remember any of the stories that those people told you, how they persevered? Because I know that in Live Not by Lies, the things that were happening to them were beyond atrocious. Like men were getting raped with tools. I
Yeah.
mean, beyond atrocious things that were happening to them, and they still held it together.
Um, the people that I've read their stories, they just said that they were willing to suffer all things for Jesus. That was just the end of it for them. And many of them went through, yeah, decades in the gulag.
It's so funny. I almost contacted you and said, do you want to like make a foil hat and we can both wear foil hats when we have this conversation? Because people write us off as hyperbolic or, you know, insane. So what I'd like to talk about are the very specific parallels of what has happened and what is happening in America that anyone with their eyes open can see. What can we say that makes people go, oh yeah, I've definitely seen that thing happen?
I think in order for people to see the parallels, they first need to see the history. And I can try to give a quick overview, but I feel like the first third of my book is that as those aspects of Soviet history of the takeover of the culture. Now, so yeah, let's go back to the beginning of the Soviet Union. The way that communism was implemented in the Soviet Union, we can't expect to see that anything like that happening in America because that was a very vast peasant population. 85+% of the population was a peasant that had just a few decades before been liberated from serfdom, essentially slavery, mostly illiterate. The country was barely just beginning to industrialize, and the people it was ripe for the picking for the Bolsheviks just to come in. They had funding to come in and just take over. And of course, there was some bad feelings towards the monarchy and the czar because they had been living really high on the hog with the people. You know, the example I use in my book is the czar and his consorts were dining on caviar in these like elaborate costumes in the palaces. Meanwhile, the peasants were living in huts with their livestock in the hut with them in the winter.
Wow.
And so they essentially lived in small barns with like a stove in the middle. And so, the chasm between those two polar ends of the populace in Russia were immense. And so there was, of course, a lot of discontent against the Tsar and the Russian Orthodox Church. The symbol of Russia is a two-headed eagle. The Russian Orthodox Church was one of the heads of the eagle, and the Tsar, the monarchy, was the other. And so they had to lop off both of those heads, the Bolsheviks did, in order to take over. So they took over, and then they began their schooling, their government schooling programs for the masses. And the people were already used to being subjugated, so of course they had the peasants that had maybe two cows instead of one, called kulaks. They would often be taken off to the gulag. The fact that Americans don't broadly know what the gulag is disgusting. It should be just as well known as concentration camps in the Holocaust. Far more people perished in the Soviet Union. In fact, they killed far more Jews. Stalin killed far more Jews than Hitler did, executed far more Jews. He didn't have gas chambers. So Hitler hasn't beat on that nastiness and horrificness. But we really need to understand that in the Soviet Union, it's upwards of 40 million people of their own people were put to death in an untimely manner, whether through execution, forced labor in the gulag, where they were completely malnourished, completely living with improper like protection from -70 temperatures in the winter, treated just as badly as the Holocaust detainees.
And these are people, I just want to make this as simple as I can for these are people who looked like each other. They were the same quote unquote race. The difference is, so it was another part of grievance culture because what they did was, like Julie said, if they had two cows instead of one. So think about in our grievance culture, we have such disparity between the different, between the different groups. I don't know if disparity is the right word. I don't want to make it sound negative, but just all of these different groups have different amounts of things. Some people would consider middle class, you make barely six figures. Some people would consider middle class, you make three times, you make at least $300,000 and you're still middle class. All of these different groups against each other is a boiling pot when they tap into grievances.
Yeah, the grievance thing, as I know that you know, is the linchpin. It's like the crucial thing that the communist playbook utilizes to locate different aggrieved classes, to be able to stoke them up to anger and resentment, to rise up, to tear down the systems of power. And of course, in America, they've harped on race and now gender identity and etc. And so, yeah, it is the same. It is the same mechanism, but we really have to understand the horrors of communism. It is something that, again, 40 million just in the Soviet Union. In China, communist China, it's upwards of 80 million. That was just in the 20th century. And we still have communist regimes executing, people, North Korea, China, that are still doing this to their populace and subjugating and controlling them. One of my favorite quotes from my book is, when communism comes knocking at your door, it doesn't say, I'm here to enslave, oppress, and murder you. It says, I'm here to liberate you from oppression. But then what you get is the subjugation, more enslavement, and mass murder.
So why is it that so many people believe it? What I hear a lot of times people say with socialism is, it hasn't been tried right yet. It hasn't been done. It hasn't been done right yet. We're going to do it right. I've never heard of a story where the outcomes work out well for anybody except for the highest class, if they can protect themselves.
Well, I mean, if you're looking at socialism, people like to look at different parts of Western Europe. I think socialism can work on smaller scales if it's a homogenous, affluent country and the people are choosing it. So it's not being implemented by force, which communism is the forceful implementation of socialism. So if you have a fairly well-off group of people that are mostly, like, they have a lot in common with their language and their culture and often their race, then yeah, on a smaller scale, that you can have socialism work to different degrees without ending in mass murder. But the forceful implementation of socialism, that's where the mass murder comes in.
So how could it even possibly work in America? Like, what are they envisioning? Because what I'm seeing as a person of color, what I am seeing is a division of people. I just interviewed Lucy Charicia, and she was at a barbecue yesterday, and she was trying to spread her message that race is a social construct, but not in the way the left looks at it. Race is a social construct, and that somebody gave it much more power than it needs to have. But the thing is that she was talking to a Hispanic person. The Hispanic person said, I like identifying by my culture. And that gets complicated, because I understand, like, taking the coolest parts of your culture and celebrating them. The problem is when you shame other people for doing it. Like, should Irish people not be able to have St. Patrick's Day, or like Russian or Eastern European not be able to have their holidays? And if they have their holidays, should we be shunned from participating in them? Because this is where it becomes this extreme division, and also that hierarchy of who's the most oppressed,
Right.
So I get to knock off the both being a person of color and aging out of the foster system, which puts me on this certain level, right, of quote unquote oppression. But I'm also straight, cisgendered, and Christian. So that brings me down. And this is just like a game of like Jenga, like pulling it out based on, actually, that would be a great game for kids, have to pull it out based on your level. And it all comes crashing down in the end.
The only answer for that is forgiveness and healing. And I'm personally of the belief that we do carry the traumas of our ancestors with us to different degrees. And so I actually do believe that there can be healing that Native Americans, African Americans, that there might need to be some legitimate healing from wounding that they're carrying, because there were some really obviously horrific atrocities carried out against those groups. But there needs to be forgiveness and healing. And the only way that we can move forward as a society is by focusing on those things instead of the grievance.
I would agree with that, but also I don't think that there's any group that hasn't had extreme oppression happen to them. So we have the Italians, and Italians in America were victims of redlining too, right? And then in their own country, well, so then do the Italians have a right to resent the Moors who took over their country? I mean, this never stops.
Never stops.
So I feel like, I mean, I definitely am a person about healing, but you cannot heal when you have a hierarchy of oppression.
The powers that be are they've gotten very masterful at stoking grievance and helping. They've taken, I don't know how many millions of Americans and made them feel very righteous in this grievance way of seeing the world.
I call it when victimhood is virtuous, there's no reason to ever give it up. So I have people who make comments on my videos. Most recently, somebody said, perhaps it's not a problem for you, but for the rest of us, it's in our DNA. And I just thought, man, that's sad. You have been so indoctrinated to believe that you cannot rise above this stuff, that you cannot. I get it. Bluntly, I was raped as a 5-year-old. So I understand having anger and being like, why this isn't fair. Life is really, really hard. If I let that permeate every single day of my life, I would have nothing that I have today. So for your own self, people need to not do this. And the crazy thing for me is that psychology shows us. I mean, we used to go to Barnes and Noble. All the self-help books are about getting over it and choosing happiness, choosing especially gratitude.
Right.
And we are replacing gratitude with grievance. But we know from that psychological level that choosing to be resentful shortens our life expectancy. And I think we know on a social level, it makes it so that people don't want to be around us. So why are these systems in place to teach people to do what we actually know, what has been proven in psychology, to do the opposite of?
Because the people doing this want power. And if everyone's at each other's throat, focusing on grievance, and they can get them to tear down different systems of power, then they can take over and have more power. I mean, people are just being used. Their pain is being used as a pawn, as a tool for people with very dark intentions. Can't think of anything more evil than that.
No, I can't either. And it's crazy to me, because all of these people that are in power got there through capitalism, the very capitalism that they want destroyed, probably to make sure that their families are always the ones on the very top. It just seems to me that there's a point where you've got enough.
If you're a normal person, yeah, but there's a certain subset of people that are highly sadistic. And again, if we study history, you can always find there's a small group of sadistic people always trying to vie for power.
Yeah.
That's just history.
So how did it infiltrate the church? Because the church seems like the safeguard, having faith, believing in the brotherhood of man, believing in a higher power than yourself, seems like the safeguard to all of this.
Yeah, it is. So Christianity is the top, or tied for the top, enemy of communism. They hate Christians. Christians have to be done away with. So in the Soviet Union, they initially went and massacred the Russian Orthodox clergy. They destroyed churches. They incarcerated the priests that didn't end up being killed. And eventually what they found is that all of that brutality still did not kill faith in a certain subset of the populace. And it actually backfired, because it bred a lot of underground Christian movements. And the tactics of the underground Christians became increasingly sophisticated. And so after World War II, the Soviet Union kind of backed off. They backed off on some of that oppression also with the death of Stalin. And they found a new tactic, and the new tactic was infiltrating the churches, that they would control the churches from within and be able to steer things and minimize the damage that the Christians were doing. And so what happened with the Russian Orthodox Church, which obviously is the main church in Russia, is that they sent KGB undercover KGB agents into the seminaries to become Orthodox priests, and a large percentage of Orthodox priests from World War II and on were undercover KGB agents. This is completely historically accurate. It's all backed up with all the evidence from the archives, even to the point where the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church in the year 2000 was actually, he started out as a KGB agent, and it was known from the archives, and they still just let him be the patriarch of the church. But in any case, and I do have a whole chapter in my book on this, how this took place in the Soviet Union. They didn't just infiltrate the Russian Orthodox Church, but it was the easiest one for them to infiltrate. And they would go in, and then they would just start watering down the doctrines. And then they also passed different laws. Oh, you can't baptize a child. They have to wait till they're 18. Oh, you can't. Oh, now that since we're not baptizing children, this is for all the churches in the Soviet Union, we're not going to allow children's groups. And we don't need women's groups either. So they would just pick things apart and very much water it down. How did infiltration of the churches happen in America? Well, it began with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation. And there was one particular man. I mean, there were several. And again, this is all documented too. And I have a whole chapter in my book on this, on the infiltration of Christianity in America. He was called the Red Dean, Henry F. Ward, the Red Dean. I mean, he was a well-known communist. He was not just, he was a pastor who had infiltrated into the seminaries in America and was teaching he actually was a teacher in the seminary. So he was teaching up and coming clergy. And he was the head of the ACLU from 1920 to 1940, and actually had to step down from the ACLU because he was too far left for the ACLU. He wrote regular columns for the Daily Worker, the official newspaper of the Communist Party of the United States. He was co-founder of the American League Against War and Fascism, which later became the Communist Party of the United States. He was a eugenicist. He would openly talk about how great the Soviet Union was. And again, he was teaching a lot of the clergy that were coming through his ranks.
Wow.
That's just
how
one
long ago?
example.
This was in the 50s?
So it really began in earnest in like 1920s, but there was even a little bit before that where there was funding for these avowed communists to go into the seminaries and teach. And by the 1950s, the National Council of Churches, well, it was called the Federal Council of Churches and then renamed National Council of Churches. It was about half of mainline Christian churches in America that belonged to that. Their upper leadership was all compromised by the 1950s with communists. And then what started to happen, and so some of the things that they would do is they watered down the doctrines in America's churches. They began literal clergy preaching from the pulpit that Jesus, they teach preaching against the literal atonement and crucifixion of Jesus, and that was just a symbol. Teaching against the divine birth of Jesus. Again, Christian clergy teaching that was kind of a fable. Demythologizing many things from the Bible. And then they would replace it with a social gospel where it was a form of social justice. And you could see how that would be an easy thing to do, because working on behalf of the oppressed is absolutely something that Jesus did.
Right.
And absolutely something that Christians have long, it's part of Christianity to look out for the person who is suffering. So it's kind of an easy switcheroo to switch out the belief in Jesus as a literal savior with, no, we're just going to work for social justice. And so that's how they duped about half of mainline churches by like the 1950s. I wrote most of my book in 2010, 2011. I pulled it out a little over a year ago to finish it. And what I found is that there's been a lot of headway of infiltration, communist infiltration of the evangelical churches in more recent years. That has been very disturbing to me personally, because the evangelicals were holdouts. They were very resistant to the Marxist incursion. And there was a bit of a Christian revival that we had in America in the 80s and 90s. And but now in the clergy of the evangelical churches and their youth pastors, there's a lot of infiltration that's taken place. I'm not going to say I come from an LDS background. I'm not going to, the LDS church appears to be the least woke of all the major churches. But since we're both here in Utah, but they don't denounce communism anymore. That's been since the late 80s that we've had someone in power who would denounce communism. He denounced it very heartily. Ezra Taft Benson did. You don't hear a peep about that now. So
I do worry that progressivism has infiltrated all churches. Christ came to wipe it all away and to give us a new start and to let us all become new people. And this, I think, would be a problem for anybody who wants that grievance culture, because we are supposed to be about joy. And that joy comes in knowing that there's nothing that we can do, that God has done this for us. And then from then on, we have this clean slate and we get to make of our lives. And I can see where that would be very problematic to the people who want to break us down and make us compliant.
And communists, they don't want to share power with God or Jesus. They want all the power for themselves. So they cannot have people laying down their grievances and following, this path of peace. No, they can't have that.
So explain to me then why it would be like, we have people who are very, very religious, and they are people in power, especially in Utah. Utah is predominantly LDS and predominantly people who, have temple recommends and talk about them regularly. Why are they embracing this?
So the way that I understand this, and I didn't come up with their first 3 categories, but I came up with 5 categories of people who promote Marxism. And it's like a pyramid. And I need to make a graphic so I can show it. The very tippy top of the pyramid is the puppet masters and the money bags. And it's like the John Rockefeller, Bill Gates people. It's those people. The next level down is avowed communists. And it's still a rather small group of people who really are truly true believers in communism. We're still at the very tip of this pyramid. The next level down from avowed communists is what FBI guy, Hoover. Oh, anyways, I can't.
J. Edgar.
Thank you, J. Edgar Hoover. The next level down is fellow travelers with the communists. They're not avowed communists, but they are sympathizers, communist sympathizers. These are the people who are many of our progressives. They see a lot of the
allies.
Yes, they see a lot of points that the avowed communists have made, and they agree with a good portion of it. They don't want a violent overthrow of society, but they want a more equitable society. These are a lot of our social justice warriors, and there's actually way more of them than there are of the avowed communists. And then the next level down is dupes of people who they don't even understand any of it. Just something sounds good, and they're like, oh, okay, that sounds good. And they are well-meaning people. And I don't even like the word dupe, because it's kind of insulting, because most of these people are actually really good-hearted people, and many of them are friends of mine. But these are people that the social justice message rings true for their hearts. They maybe are really, and I am too. I get very upset when I hear about people being harmed and being mistreated. It really bothers me. These people have really soft
empathetic, extremely empathetic people.
Yes, yes. Post-religious people who have left their religion and perhaps having falling out with religion are particularly vulnerable to becoming duped into the social justice Marxist. And then there's one more level that is really important for us to discuss, and that is, I call them level 2 dupes. And these are people that they want to be nice. They don't want to ruffle any feathers. They don't necessarily agree with that whole structure of the social justice and the Marxist stuff. And they're like, but I don't want to come across as a bigot. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings.
I
And so
see,
they're
and
level
I'm
two.
gonna be blunt, but I'm gonna say that's the group that in my head I'm constantly going coward.
Yeah.
And I know that's harsh, but I'm
No.
just like, you're gonna give up everything. And not just for you, because really, like ourselves, that's one thing. But
Right.
for our kids,
Yeah.
you're gonna give up everything for them and make them live
Yeah.
under full on Marxism.
Yeah.
You're going to do that because you don't want somebody to call you a name.
Right. Going back to your point of asking about all of these carrying LDS folks in power in Utah. And again, I think many of them are level two. I think we have a lot of level one and level two dupes among them, because I think the majority of them are well intended. But I do think that we get some of them are higher up on the hierarchy, perhaps. And there's one little tidbit of it's something that someone else can research, because I just began this research, but it very much deals with Utah and our subversion of our culture in Utah, of why I think one of the things that I found that shows me that Utah was very much targeted. So I'm sure you've heard of liberation theology. And then I have quotes from people who defected from the KGB saying that they created liberation theology. They created the Latin American version of it, and also the Black American, African American Black liberation theology, which is all about grievance. It takes Christianity and twists it into a critical race theory grievance fest. And so the man who started, who quote unquote supposedly originated with him, he actually gives credit to these two pastors, they were white, named James and Alice Boyack. And I happened to be like, well, I was really curious of who is James and Alice Boyack, because this was back in like the 60s in some like Podunk, Iowa. It was somewhere in the Midwest, some seminary where they were teaching at. Well, it turns out after they got this guy, Reverend Cohn, to start Black liberation theology, which was this complete Marxist construct, they came on over to Salt Lake City, and they came on over to Westminster College, and they were very influential, very highly thought of. To me, it looks like they could be KGB operatives. They could have been KGB operatives. And if you look at Westminster College and how very far left Westminster College was, I believe James Boyack became like the dean of students or something. He was very high up, and they were very influential in the greater Christian world in Salt Lake City outside of the LDS faith. And I think they were pushing a very progressive form of Christianity, which infiltrated form of Christianity. And I think that would be a great thing for someone to research, because I think there's probably a lot there.
And also, so I lived here about 12 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Utah was a very different place than it is now. It was not like, that's why we felt that this was a safe place to come to. So what happened? I've heard that after Proposition 8 changed the other direction.
I don't know. I think it's a mixture between greater cultural elements at play and more specific ones specific for Salt Lake City. I do think that perhaps there was a lot of influence, because there is, again, I don't have anything against people who are gay. I have friends who are gay.
Sure,
but
yeah.
the gay agenda, I'll separate the gay agenda from gay people.
Yes.
The gay agenda seems to have been pushed quite heavily in Salt Lake City, and it seems to be being pushed quite heavily at BYU right now, to try to fracture culture here in Utah. I think the greater cultural elements of that, the Marxists have been really good at targeting post-religious people who've become disgruntled with their faith. And I think there was has been tons of that's taken place in Salt Lake. I will just also say that in my research, I came across, this was much earlier in like the 1930s, that the Communist Party was asking people who were members of the US Communist Party to go back into their churches as lay people and infiltrate. And there was one LDS man in Salt Lake City listed as he was a communist. He ran a communist cell in Salt Lake, and he was sent back to rejoin his congregation, and who knows what he did in his congregation. I have no idea. Again, the Mormon voting bloc has, I believe, long been a target of subversion, and to get that, push that left and push it further and further left, It's definitely
Yeah.
worked.
Oh, for sure. Our Overton window, it's like people are, how come you're calling me this or saying, saying that I'm so far over here, and it has moved. So
Yeah.
those of us who just said had the same values that we had 10 years ago, we've suddenly been pushed way over here, even though
Right.
our values are the same ones that everyone had 10 years ago.
Mhm.
We're just, as Barack Obama said, clinging to our religion. And
Yeah.
because we cling to our faith, we're now far right.
Yeah.
When the whole world was with us, they
Yeah.
all moved.
And if you want to mention you mentioned Barack Obama. I mean, his mentor was an avowed communist. But in any case, Obama does say that he was his mentor, and he was an avowed communist. He was actually under watch, like like the FBI was watching him, and that was who mentored that president that we had for those 8 years. So there was definitely a lot of progress, and I was very alarmed during that time.
Yeah. I mean, whenever I hear the word progress, again, it's a manipulation of words. We think of progress as being a good thing, moving forward. It's extremely regressive.
Yeah.
So the progressive movement is extremely regressive. I was speaking to somebody, well, uh, I did a thing on PBS, and I was talking to them afterwards, and they were like, we're just so excited to finally get to talk about race, and I was like, I am not a little zoo creature for you to interrogate and investigate, and to like treat me like some sort of a pet.
Yeah.
That is not progress. I wanted to hit the things that you talked about on the last video that you made with that when you sent me the interview,
Mhm.
the points and where we're at in those points.
Okay. Yeah, and I actually wanted to talk about this too. So there's a fantastic interview, and you can find different versions of it on YouTube, but it was G. Edward Griffin interviewing Yuri Bezmenov, who had been a KGB operative working for the Soviet Union in India, and he defected to the West in the late 70s. And in this interview, which took place in 1985, Bezmenov tells the 4 steps to subverting a society to communism. And he's like, the great efforts that the KGB, like vast majority of our efforts went towards these 4 things in various other nations. And Yuri Bezmenov was giving a warning to the United States in 1985 that we were already the first step was completed, which is demoralizing a generation of young people, training them into Marxism and socialism, to believe it and embrace it with open arms. And it takes between 15 and 20 years to do that, to train up a generation in that ideology. And by 1985, again, he said it was way overfulfilled. And of course, by 2022, we're so far beyond overfulfilled, it's not funny. And the second step in turning a nation communist is destabilization. This takes 2 to 5 years, according to him. And I believe we've already been in this for over 2 years here in America, beginning in March of 2020, because this is where you have your different infrastructures being destabilized: healthcare, businesses, international relations, energy, production. There's all the different aspects of a society. And the problem is that takes 2 to 5 years. We've already been in that for 2 years. Step 3, it only takes 6 weeks. Step 3 is crisis. And there's often like some kind of crisis with perhaps like a threat of war or something like that. And then step 4 is already the nation has fallen to communism, and it's called normalization, which is when they go through and deal with the dissidents and just make sure everything is implemented and the society is under a totalitarian regime. And too late, it's already fallen.
What I tend to believe is that even with all of these crazy steps that are happening and where we're at, which is pretty drastic, right?
I believe we're in destabilization, which is the second step, but we don't know how long it is from now to the third step. And once you hit the third
which is
step,
crisis.
crisis.
And you would think that the pandemic was crisis.
I think that crisis stage where the country can become taken over by a new leadership, I don't think we're there yet.
Can you explain that to me? Because I don't think I understand.
Well,
completely taken over. I mean,
America. So these 4 steps that Bezmenov talks about are for a complete takeover. tyrannical takeover of a nation. And America, I think, is a particularly tough nut to crack. And that, like we were discussing, I think off camera, about the Second Amendment, we have some safeguards in place that make us a particularly tough nut to crack. But for destabilization, between that and crisis, I don't see that we're in a crisis phase yet, because that is like imminent destruction. Like it's like the end. And we still have a lot more. Well, I don't know how much more destabilization, but they're working on it.
Right.
They seem to be working on it pretty diligently.
Right.
So.
Yeah. So I was thinking that if neighbor can turn against neighbor, which is something that happens a lot in communism, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So if neighbor can turn against neighbor, and we've already had that. I interviewed a local sheriff, and he said he was shocked at how many people would turn each other in over COVID restrictions and just having an extra car at your house. So that
Wow.
makes me go, I don't understand how easily people are manipulated to turn on the neighbors that they've had for years. But on the other thing that I was wondering about that was, if you look at the infiltration and how it's hit our churches, it's also hit our schools. In the same conversation I had had with the sheriff when I was speaking with him, I specifically spoke about a certain militant group of young people that has become very famous.
Right.
And he said, well, they would never come here. We would stop it before it came. And I thought, but not if they're homegrown. Not if teachers. I was on Facebook and I saw a teacher post about how important it is that your kids learn the new civics, which the new civics, I've got pictures of what they want in these civics classes, especially in California. And they are very, very bent towards one side. This is not just about respect your neighbors, contribute to your community. This is join a protest.
My one experience with Antifa was a couple of years ago. There was someone in a community Facebook group said, oh, Antifa is going to have a protest downtown St. George, so let's counter protest. What was said in that thread, and there was this guy claimed he was an Antifa officer. He was proud of it. He claimed, proud that Antifa has an organization like a military. And he's like, don't you worry, your day will come, St. George. We are in all the towns in the whole country already, just waiting.
Now, I do think that they, having lived in Seattle when during Chaz and Chop, and
oh gosh,
yeah, no, in the heart of it. Okay. So having lived there when it was happening, I do think that a lot of this is role playing.
Oh yeah.
The problem is that it's heavily funded role playing.
Yes.
So, and they don't have a sense, if your life is gaming, okay, if your life is just gaming, you have no real sense of the harm that you cause another human being, because it's the virtual. And I feel like that's another one of the attacks. So in terms of it being like Mao, it feels like death by 1,000 cuts. Everywhere you look, like every single day, I'll put something out and I'll be like, this is what we're focusing on, parents. And then it's like a hydra. You cut one off and another one sprouts up, or two more sprout up, and you're just like, oh my gosh, does this ever end? But for them, it is like role playing. And the second that you fight back, they go back into their hidey holes. They need to be in groups. They can't just stand on their own. They cannot stand on their own reason, because reason is not part of postmodernism. Wow, this is truly everywhere. And I feel like part of that is because of technology. And that's what I've kind of wondered from all the way back when I asked you before, did this all start around Prop 8, and then did it just switch? But if you think about it, that's kind of when technology became,
that's when social media started taking off. And yeah, it's hard for me to say since I moved to Salt Lake in 2007, like I said, and I didn't live in Utah prior to.
So let's go back to those 5 points that you have and where we're at. What hope do we have? What can we do? First off, where do your credentials come from?
Mhm.
like, because you said that you studied this in college, it's was your thesis. So where does that come from? And how can we make people see reason and hope? Because I
Yeah,
don't like to leave without hope.
right. Well, yeah, so I served a mission, an LDS mission in Russia in the late 90s. And oh, and I had studied Russian in college prior to that. Served a mission in Russia in the late 90s. And then I came back and I attended graduate school, and I got two master's degrees, one in Russian and East European studies, and the other in Russian language and literature. And my thesis was for my Russian and East European studies degree, in which I studied Soviet history, and went down into very deep into studying some specific underground Christian movements, actually specifically underground Baptists, Pentecostals, and Seventh-day Adventists. They were considered the absolute scum of the earth in the Soviet Union. Worse, they had worse status than rapists and murderers. And I had met some people on my mission. I met this one old woman who her faith was just this regal big thing, and she was teaching us, and I was like, wow, where did this come from? And I met a few of those people, of those Christians that had gone through the Soviet era with their faith intact, and it was just so magnificent and awe-inspiring to me. And so that's kind of where I got my interest in researching that. I was also really blessed. Most universities, this is not the case. The head of my Russian department at Florida State happened to be Russian herself. She was a Soviet dissident who was able to leave the Soviet Union in the 70s. She actually threatened to set herself on fire on the steps of the embassy in Moscow if the Soviet government didn't give her an exit visa to leave the country. And
Wow.
the day before she was going to do that, protest suicide, she was granted an exit visa, and she ended up with her PhD in Russian literature, heavily focusing on dissident literature of the Soviet era. So that was a heavy focus when I was learning from her in graduate school. And man, she told some stories. That's my credentials. I did work on my thesis for 2 years. I did go and do original research in Russia and met with the people who were part of some of these underground movements that I was researching, and was able to get materials from them, translate some of those materials, use them in my thesis. But I began seeing in about 2008, 2009, I began seeing some of the same things I studied in my thesis, I began seeing happening in America, and I became very alarmed. And I looked deeper and I saw way more and it was shocking. And in terms of studying how this has happened in America, once again, I'm very grateful for the scholarship of James Lindsay in helping me understand the more recent Marxist incursion in our schools in particular. There have been people all along who have been, trying to get the word out, and they've been poo-pooed and called various names of various sorts. I did the thing actually that got me to write my book, and that's something that most people don't put together with anything to do with Marxism, is the severe persecution of the fringe Christian movements. So they would infiltrate the mainline Christian and then severely, severely persecute. We're talking torture, imprisonment, execution of the religious fringes. And I started seeing the FLDS fundamentalist Mormons had a raid on their compound in Texas, and they had all their children forcibly removed with no allegations against any person, no evidence. And then they had boxes and boxes of personal materials seized without, they got a retroactive search warrant for that material. And I was like, wow, because that's what they did in the Soviet Union to Baptists, is they would take their children and take them from the parents, because the parents were harming the children by teaching them religion. And so,
And we've heard this, like there was a PBS producer who said that we should take away all of the conservative children. That was just in the last election.
wow.
So, and
See, I haven't even heard that. So here's what I think. If we allow our schools to be fully subverted, and they're already well on their way, the next target will be the churches, will be forced to become even more woke. And the ones that don't cooperate will get the Branch Davidian FLDS treatment. And I have another chapter on the Branch Davidian debacle that took place in 1993, which is one of the most horrible chapters in 20th century American history. Not that I agreed with David Koresh, not that I agree with Warren Jeffs either, and certainly both of those individuals could have had charges against them for various things. But what you do is you make an example, and this is what happens with slavery also. You make an example of someone who is not complying, and you beat them to a pulp to show everyone else this is what happens if you don't comply. Well, that it's very effective. It scares a lot of people into submission. If we don't stand up en masse, and if we allow our children to be subverted in the schools even more and more, the churches will be forced next. And if there's any churches that won't go in line, there will be some more of that treatment. We'll have some more kids taken and some more raids and various things.
I think that's an interesting, I was talking to my pastor about this very thing, because I was like, what is the world going to be like for him? What are we leaving for these kids? Because it seems like, talk about robbing them. You know, millennials will say they took everything. We can't be wealthy. We can never achieve. And I'm like, you're taking literally everything, including their right to faith. And my pastor said, yeah, it's super scary times for sure. But in the worst circumstances, always the church thrives in the worst circumstances. Pushing it underground, it thrives. And so I feel like that's something that we can have hope for. But how did they do that? How did they manage to survive? Because you would think that if they've got like the KGB or whatever kind of operatives, they would have known, or they would have figured it out. And are there any tactics? Like what can we do when you say something and all of a sudden you go to your phone and it picks up what you just said?
Yeah. The underground Soviet Christians and also the human rights activists in the Soviet Union really came up with some pretty sophisticated ways to avoid detection. But they were also willing to take the heat, and they were willing to be imprisoned and tortured and executed.
I feel like so many parents today are so afraid of that. Like right now, I know of several parents who stood up at school board meetings and said their piece. And one of them shared her court order today. She's going to court because of that here. And that makes a lot of people go, oh, I don't want to make waves.
Who is coming against her?
Department of Justice.
Yeah,
so
it's terrifying.
It's been militarized, which is why I'm wondering, where are we really in these phases? Because it has.
They're trying to hurry up and get to the crisis, I think. So here's what we have to do. We've got to take this information on the Marxist incursion in our schools to our principals, in fact, and to our school board members. And we have to educate them, and we have to ask them, take a look at this, tell me what you think. And we don't need to do it in a way that is rude or disrespectful, and share this with them, and then follow up with them. Okay, what do you think about this? What can we do about this? And if they don't have anything to say, like, well, we have to remove the Marxist elements from our schools. And then there's a whole list. We have the SEL programs, we have all the critical theory crap, all that has to go. We've got the brainwashing, adaptive learning curricula that has to go, and a few other things. The pornographic books from the comprehensive sexuality education, that stuff has to go. Sorry, delete button, gone. And if not, we have to say, we are not going to keep our children in schools. We will come up with a different solution, and we will take a lot of people with us, and we have to make good on that. And same thing for the churches. We've got to take this information to our church leaders, whatever church, wherever anyone may be living. I'm not targeting any specific church here, and have them read this information. Mine is quite heavily focuses on the church aspect. Have them look at the information, again, not in a accusatory way, because chances are our individual church leaders are very well intended themselves. And
I think that we have to be careful with that, right? Because we can't just give a blanket statement and say, oh, they go to church, so they're totally safe and they're totally on our side. They're just a little misled. I think that what I believe we should do is we go to them with all the grace and the completely, we're here to help. If they don't respond to that, or if they respond that we're crazy, then we take it to more. Well, I used to work for, it's funny, comprehensive sex ed. Well, I used to, with a theater company, teach child abuse prevention in schools. Kind of controversial, but it was very clear, like the words we had to use. We worked with the police department and how do we keep kids safe? And what we would say is tell someone until you get help. And I think parents need to apply that same thing. Tell someone until you get help. Do not be afraid of making waves.
Yes.
Because our children will have to live on their knees. You want to talk about how bad slavery is? Let's not bring it back.
We have to be willing to go the distance, and we need massive numbers of people. In Washington County here where I live, we've made some great strides with beginning to educate our local school board members. And we got copies of my book to I gave copies of my book to all of the school board members here, and also to about 2/3 of our county principals, and following up with them. Some of them are responding positively. Some of them, I don't think they get it. We're not going to reach every single person, but we may not have, I don't feel like I have control over who is in the White House. Right. I don't feel like I have control over some of the weird things going on in Washington, D.C., but we have control in our local areas with our local churches and with our schools, and we can educate other parents, get this information out ASAP. I'm actually working with someone to make a documentary about my book so that it's something that would be much more digestible for people rather than reading a book that I know a lot of people don't want to sit and read a lengthy book. To get this information out. And there's other great information too that people could share, but they need to be sharing legitimate things. And some of it needs to include legitimate history from either the Soviet Union or China to show these parallels. With all the, citations and documents.
And does your book do that? Like, are there clear graphics where people can see this?
Oh yeah, I have over 100 pages of endnotes. I have over 600 citations.
Great.
In my book. And I even tell people you can get my book and you can Xerox these certain chapters, because for the in terms of approaching the schools, there's only like 4 chapters of my book that are really more essential for the education part of it. And then for the churches, there's a little bit more. But people can buy the book and then Xerox. I don't care.
And where do they get their book? Is it on Amazon?
It's on Amazon. It's also at my website, beneathsheepsclothing.com. And want to be able to help organize people or connect people. I know we have Utah Parents United here in Utah, which are doing a lot of great work. And there's, is it Moms for Liberty?
Right.
In other parts of the country that are doing a lot of good things, trying to get the word out. And then the other thing, of course, is the media and the entertainment we view in our homes with our kids. It's hard, but we can control that. Those are things that we can actually do and actually can make a huge difference. And we have to threaten also with the churches. If the churches will not remove the Marxist elements from the church, then we will leave that church.
Right. Absolutely. No, what I always say is not in our homes, not in our schools, not in our communities. Just keep it as small and as local as you can. And I sometimes feel intimidated, even though I'm a bold voice for this. I feel intimidated when my neighbors put up the intersectionality flag. I feel like, oh gosh, well, if I go, I might make waves with this person or I might make waves with that person. And I'm like, I can't care. Right. I'm like, if people want to hate me, they can hate me, but I can't care because I have too much love for country and too much love for children to put them into that useless class. Because I have literally talked to people who have fallen on their knees and cried, going, where do I go from here? Because when people come here from communist countries, they actually, I don't know if they still do, but even up to 20 years ago, they had to be deprogrammed. They had to go into camps themselves and learn like American ways of being, especially people who came here from Asia. And they're just like, what? Where do we go from here? You do not even know what we escaped. And I didn't know. I didn't know about Pol Pot.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the Marxism in South Africa. I didn't know any of this stuff until the last 2 years. And then I start listening, and you can go on YouTube, you can just Google Marxism South Africa, and you can listen to Africans telling you, hey, he said it was going to be a great idea, and we had identity politics, and everything that we're doing now, they already did, to horrible horrible ways. Can you remember any of the stories that those people told you, how they persevered? Because I know that in Live Not by Lies, the things that were happening to them were beyond atrocious. Like,
and many of them went through, decades in the gulag. One of the stories that is most touching to me, this man right here was the leader of the underground Seventh-day Adventist church. And sorry, I'm
no, it's fine.
a little emotional. Some of the quotes about him, first of all, take a look at him. This is someone who had spent time in the gulag. He was full of love, and he had fellow prisoners. In fact, when he converted a very prominent Soviet human rights activist, Alexander Ginsburg, very well known. He actually converted Alexander Ginsburg back to Christianity when they were in the gulag, because he was full of love and he was full of light and truth. And Ginsburg, I have a quote here where he said it was because of men like Shulkov that Christianity would survive in the Soviet Union, and it would not only survive, it would be stronger than ever someday. And it's truly just individual people choosing to do what's right at all cost. And honestly, that's always what it has been, I think, through history. The people who have steered history in a positive direction, it's individual people who will not back down and will do what is right, whatever the consequences. And that's just how we get to be. So
no, that's exactly the kind of hope that I was looking for. I mean, it really is stand up. And what I find is never about our words, it's about our actions.
mm-hmm.
So they can slander you, live a life of character so well that whenever somebody says something bad about you, nobody's going to believe it. And I think that's what draws people. And I think that ultimately what keeps people, I mean, this is the situation spiritually of the wheat from the shaft, right? Or is it, I think every religion is probably going to break up. I think there's going to be a big purge, and progressivism is going to become kind of like the one world religion that I know is going to sound all hokey, but they're finishing that temple right now. That group is kind of scary. But people are going to wonder what it is that we have, especially as the grievance culture takes on and more people really suffer with true depression. Like we suffer with discouragement. We suffer with frustration. Why won't people just wake up? We're not the crazy ones, right? So we suffer with those, but underneath it, we have this hope.
Yeah. Communism focuses on destruction of society, destruction of institutions, destruction of lives, and we get to focus on creation. Each of us is here for a reason. We each have something unique to contribute, but creative, constructive endeavors, whatever it is,
even
that we're
the simple things like motherhood. It seems to me like all of these things always want to push us into a collective. And when we're pushed into a collective, we lose our humanity. The people who've survived always hold on to their humanity. Just lastly, it's interesting to have this conversation about Russia with how many people are hostile towards Russia these days. And again, I think it's important. It's vital in every situation. We are manipulated to hate people.
Yeah.
And all of this, I believe, everything that we're going through is about diminishing our humanity to the point that these other people, the people up here, already think we are. They already believe that we're worthless.
Right.
We are nothing but pawns.
Right.
The only way that we win is if we unite. We all stand together.
Yes.
For truth. And we say, you know what? Come what may. Come what may. Because, again, we have this hope. And you don't get to take that from us.
Absolutely. I 100% agree.
Julie, it's been amazing having you on. And so again, where can they get your book? What is your book called? How can people contact you?
So it's Beneath Sheep's Clothing, the Communist Takeover of Culture in the USSR and Parallels in Today's America. and it's available from my website, beneathsheepsclothing.com, and also from Amazon. I'm working with a documentary filmmaker to make a trailer, and hopefully we can get some funding to make this into a documentary in the next 6 to 8 months or so, and reach even more people. And people can also email me at beneathsheepsclothing@gmail.com if they have any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I've really appreciated having you on.